Hello, everybody. My name is Mark. I'm principal at the Rockaway Blockchain Fund, and I'm in it for the tech. So it has all started in 2015 with the inception of Ethereum, a smart contract platform blockchain that actually found a very good use case, and the programmable money has taken off. Ethereum has unfortunately become a victim of its own success. The utilization has increased tremendously, and with it, increased the fees as well. What we have seen, and probably many in the room can relate, paying a gas fees of tens, hundreds, and sometimes even thousands of dollars if the transaction was very critical. Fortunately, this is not where the innovation has stopped, and currently we can already say that we are living in the multi-chain world. We can look at the two sides. One is the developers that confirms it, second is the users. If you look at the developers, at the moment there is roughly 18,000 developers in the ecosystem, which is a tremendous jump because from the last year it's 100% increase. And this is a statistics and people that significantly stay and they are sticky to the ecosystem. So typically when the developers come, they stay. What we can see is that even though Ethereum from the 18,000 has 4,000 developers at the moment in total, which accounts for like 21%. However, if we look at where the growth is actually coming from, it's coming from all the other chains. And we can see, for example, Solana, Near, Kusama, and other ecosystem growing 4x over the last year. Then we can look at the other side of the coin, and that's the value locked, or basically the money that is currently used in the DeFi protocols on chain. And here, currently, north of $200 billion locked. What we can see is that the value is currently already fragmented across many chains. However, one message is very clear, that the Ethereum is slipping. And like when we have spoken last time in Zurich, it was above 60%, now we are at 55%. The most apt metaphor for the blockchains and why the world will be multi-chains is we can think of them as cities. In the world, there's like different cities and they have all different benefits. Some are great for family life, some are great for careers, some are great for going for skiing. They have all different purposes and they're optimized differently and cater for different people. In this sense, in the same manner, also the blockchains are like cities, and they have different use cases. Some are more secure, some have quicker finality, some are more interconnected. What we can see is in the multi-chain world, however, the interconnectivity or interoperability that is provided through the bridges is extremely important. And we can see that we have gone from May, if you look at, for example, EVM bridges, in terms of the TVL locked, from almost nothing to 20 billion value locked, which is amazing. However, we are still early, and all of us probably can recall some of the attacks. To name a few, the wormhole attack where 300 million has been stolen, or a Polymarket where 600 million has disappeared. However, we are not early only in terms of the bridges and the interoperability, but also in terms of the whole tech stack. So what I would like to do now is actually walk you through how does the tech stack look like for example application. To make it concrete, let's pick an example. Let's say I would like to make a bet on a horse. So to do that, there is going to be a first layer, basically the end user layer is going to be, imagine an iPhone application in which we are able to see different races, different games. We would like to do a horse. In it, in terms of the authentication, that's going to be managed by the wallet's key management, which is in terms of the users, and that logging can be used across multiple different applications. So it's not only for the one application, but it's cross. Within the application, for example, we would like to bet on a horse called Bucky. And we see that Bucky has very good odds, 3-1, and we would like to go with that. So how is this 3-1 going to be calculated? For those, we would employ the storage, because we need to have some kind of a historical data that has all the information of all the past races where Bucky has competed and also the other horses. we also need to be able to compute what are the probabilities. And this would be happening in the compute part of the layer. So once we decide we would like to place a wager of 10 pounds, out of the wallet, the RPC will lock and escrow the 10 pounds into a smart contract on the layer 1 or on the, into the smart contract wherever it's deployed. Then the race goes on and it's concluded. For example, Bucky has won, and now we need to bring this information into the blockchain. So actually the smart contract can resolve and make a decision whether we have won. And for these, the oracles are basically the solution that are bridging the gap and bringing the off-chain data onto the blockchains. And they can bring the results of the race so that the smart contract can resolve and actually settle automatically and trustlessly the wager that we had. So all of these different Legos somehow interact. Some of them are employed in some of the applications, some are less. However, one thing is clear. At the moment, we are quite early, and all of these have different key issues and key challenges and key opportunities, which I would like to now discuss with our guests. So let me welcome on stage Nivan from Solana, Sergey from Axelar, and Honor from Interchain. Hello. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to see you again. Can you please introduce yourself and also tell us a bit about yourself and your story? How did you get into the industry?
Sure. Thanks for having me, guys. My name's Nivan. I'm the CFO of the Solana Foundation. The foundation's focused more on our validator growth and making early-stage grants to developers building projects on the network. And my background prior to crypto was more in traditional finance. I was working in mobile payments and new payment flows with Visa, and was kind of first introduced to blockchain maybe in 2012, kind of more of like the competitive landscape, how it could affect payments. And kind of immediately it kind of spoke to me. It seems like, you know, the internet, financial services hasn't really caught up with the internet. The fact that we can only trade in certain hours a day, that funds clear once a day at midnight, that there's no funds clearing over the weekend. So it seemed like there were a lot of use cases, and that's kind of what attracted me to the industry, more on just the financial services side. And obviously it's much broader than that when we look at all the other use cases.
Awesome. Hey, yeah, great to be here. So I'm Sergey. My background is technical. Worked on everything in the industry from networking technologies like software-defined networking, studied formal cryptography at MIT, did a lot of protocol work, standardization work, and afterwards got into the blockchain space. Has been working, since 2015 on various protocols. We, with my co-founder, built one layer 1 blockchain called Algorand that we launched to the market, and then kind of more recently, we started to see this new growing pain for the ecosystem around interoperability. And so we started Project Axelar to specifically focus on that because we think it's going to be a critical infrastructure piece that needs to be solved correctly. And that's what excites us the most.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm Honor. I'm currently leading the Cosmos Builders program. My intro into crypto was pretty straightforward because I grew up with this notion of money being quite fragile, especially with like the family background in the Middle East, and then overnight people losing a lot of their wealth and crying and drama. So I never really had this idea of sound fiat money, and when I discovered crypto, it just like immediately clicked and was super interesting. So
thank you very much for the introduction. So we have seen the adoption curve of the internet and how the crypto adoption compares to it. Like, what do you consider the most significant challenges and opportunities that are still ahead of us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been an interesting evolve, especially in the past 2 years. With DeFi, we quickly saw the uptake with kind of the crypto-native audience, with some things getting more on the creative side. With NFTs, it's like the more digital native audience is coming in, and I think the next big leap could be kind of for mass adoption would be getting more of kind of a mass audience involved. And I think the kind of opportunity and challenge there is like self-custody and holding your own keys might be kind of an intimidating learning set to really bring in the next billion or 2 billion people onto crypto. But I think there's some interesting things taking place. One project that's built on Solana is a music streaming platform, Audius, and you basically, new users don't really realize, but there is a wallet in the background. So these use cases where it's still a very seamless experience for the brand new user and someone who's not very digitally native. You know, when you got on the internet, you didn't need to really understand how HTML worked. There were UIs and use cases built for you that made it very seamless for you, and I think that's where we can see big leaps in user growth.
Yeah, so I think, like, from my perspective, I think if you look at the analogy from the development with Web 2 and Web 3, I think in some sense like Web 3 is further along in the use cases and adoption, but behind on the infrastructure stuff, right? And I think the reason for this is that people quickly kind of realize some of these financial use cases actually, incredibly interesting and incredibly valuable, right? So a lot of money went into the space and keeps on going, and a lot of interesting use cases have been built. People forget about the infrastructure sometimes. That's what's going to be powering, all these use cases. So to me, that's the piece that's, still needs to be solved. Interoperability kind of is a part of it. And kind of going back to how do we get to billions of users, it's a question of better user experiences, right? And it's a better user experiences through layers of infrastructure and protocols that have to be built for the applications to interact with different ecosystems, interact with different wallets and different parties, and yeah. So to me, that's the most interesting, challenge and opportunity to continue growing the space.
Yeah, I fully agree with Sergey. I think we've seen an interesting adoption because of the more interesting distribution mechanisms of these networks. Because of these more open distributions, adoption was solved right off the bat. But I think user experience is definitely, personally, I think the biggest challenge right now. I mean, if you just take a single ecosystem itself, it's already complicated enough handling with wallets, especially if those are self-custodied. But in a cross-chain, multi-chain environment, it gets so much more complicated. I don't know like how many different wallets everyone has to use with the different accounts, not even speaking of transferring these assets back and forth. But I think user experience is definitely the #1 challenge that we need to tackle.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And in terms of decentralization, right? So how far have we come? Like, are we, in terms of the infrastructure, decentralized? Not? How do you perceive it?
I feel like it's still very decentralized. I mean, there's some obvious cases of centralization with, say, Coinbase and maybe Binance, but that's specifically in the exchange space. I think by nature, it's basically the whole blockchain world it's open source on steroids. It's it's communities and there's a token for economic incentives and you build, as opposed to the old model of giving your software away for free and paying for managed service. And so with it being open source, there's many different builders and projects and ecosystems and brand new use cases and ecosystems that we don't even know of. So I feel like it's still very decentralized and will be for a while.
Yeah, so I guess like my thinking is that like on the layer ones or blockchains themselves, we're pretty good in terms of decentralization when it comes to the protocol. We're probably not as good when it comes to like stake concentration in some chains, right? So you have few actors that have pretty powerful stake to make decisions on the protocols, but the protocols are decentralized, so it's like it's a gradual process to decentralize some of the stake. I mean, I think some pieces of infrastructure, including some of the interoperability pieces, are pretty centralized today, and I think that's a big risk for the ecosystem that we are trying to solve. I think places like exchanges, there's still a lot of values concentrated, but I think I'm super excited to see more decentralized exchanges, becoming more useful and usable. And so I think that migration is going to continue towards more decentralized, front ends and exchanges. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really look at it from a percentage threshold perspective of whether we are sufficiently decentralized or not. I think at the end of the day, we need to make the right trade-offs. And if you take, for example, base layer infrastructure, even ISPs, cables, all that stuff that we're all relying on is still super centralized. But I think that's okay because we're focusing on other areas first. That being said, I think making sane trade-offs when designing applications that are open and permissionless, I think I agree that the layer ones I think are already at a very good stage today.
Mm. Could you maybe, because staying with the decentralization topic, maybe could you, and that's probably good for the audience, how are you in your, I don't know, projects, foundation, thinking about the decentralization? Like, how are you thinking to, I don't know, decentralize the Axelar node network, etc.? How did Solana approach it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, being a layer one, it's more, we're pretty, agnostic. We're not trying to pick a winner for NFT or a winner for audio streaming. It's trying to get for the token itself, get on as many exchanges as we can, get on as many bridges as we can, so the interoperability is there.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, we started at solving the core problem, which was designing kind of a protocol that's decentralized enough to do interoperability and the bridging problem. That effort technically is incredibly challenging, so we try to keep ourselves pretty focused and as a small kind of technical team, just going at it and kind of building out the technology. And more recently, as we started the mainnet rollout, we are now thinking about token distribution and decentralizing like the voting around the network and the kind of upgrade protocols and so on and so forth. So I do think that for kind of heavy infrastructure projects, kind of a progressive decentralization is probably the path. I mean, I don't think you can have kind of decentralized protocol sort of on day one and continue building fast. Unfortunately, there's a bit of friction. So, but I think progressive decentralization, certain projects have already kind of played out that playbook, I think, quite well, and that's what we're trying to adhere to as well.
Yeah, in the Cosmos ecosystem, by nature, all those different sovereign application-specific chains are already, to some extent, decentralized. So that seems to be relatively straightforward. What I find fascinating is actually from a regulatory and legal perspective, kind of creating structures without beneficiary owners that can actually be governed in a decentralized fashion, solving like some of the liability issues. I think these are also some of the questions we're constantly tackling besides the tech stuff, which is core.
Mm-hmm. Understand. So I have been discussing that the world is already multi-chain. What are the use cases that keeps you excited?
For me, I think kind of focusing on getting the next couple billion users. I think the ones that are kind of more on the creative or even brand new use cases that are fun and engaging, play-to-earn games, gaming, and NFTs, I think are very interesting just because there's, a kind of a fan base kind of just instead of investors doing DeFi or digitally crypto natives enjoying getting yield, it's broader than that. It's something that speaks to a broader audience. I think that's what I kind of find exciting and fun.
I mean, I think to me, a couple use cases that people have tried to solve that's still unsolved in the blockchain ecosystem today. For instance, like payments, I think it's still quite interesting. People have been talking about it for a while, and you can use it here and there, but I think the timing wasn't right in some sense. A lot of the infrastructure that people have tried to build on it was kind of expensive. So now we have better layer one. So I think we're going to see a second wave of payments, kind of a stable assets and stable coins grow in that process. So I think that's pretty exciting. I mean, I am personally very excited about kind of cross-chain use cases where you have an asset on Solana, you see an application on Cosmos, you just want to go and interact with it directly, right, with this application. So kind of a cross-chain use cases where what we have seen is in the blockchain ecosystem, like different chains almost like their own countries or communities, right, that have a certain profile of user bases, that have a certain profile of applications, and kind of connecting them actually together and continuing this mix of communities, I think is going to be quite interesting.
So earlier in a panel, someone talked about active and passive fund strategies. And if you think about like just buying a token and having, holding it in a passive fashion, I think what I'm most excited about is actually cross-chain composable DeFi, so very, very active form of deploying and managing these assets. And just to maybe like give one example, I think in the future we'll see something where you'll be able to stake a network, stake a token to secure a network. With something like liquid staking, you'll be able to take that same asset and deploy it maybe in DeFi, maybe provide liquidity for a certain asset, or do something else with it, or put it as collateral to take a loan. And I think that's super exciting, just to kind of have this composable cross-chain DeFi, which will enable a whole new set of use cases that I think we're definitely not seeing to the fullest today.
Yeah, I'm also personally like super excited with the payment, like especially in the Solana Hacker House, there was a possibility to pay with the Solana Pay. So it was amazing to, finally purchase a real Coke Zero with Solana. Maybe staying with the multi-chain narrative, because you all come from bit different angles into the multi-chain world. Like, how does your multi-chain world look like? Because from the answers that I just got now, I have a sense that it looks a bit different for all of you.
I mean, for me, the multi-chain world looks like a single chain world where users don't have to think about what chain kind of the applications are on. Developers can make the best choices, kind of where to host it, how to develop it, what's the best platform, for their specific use case, whether or not they want, high throughput from Solana, right, or some other decentralization properties, or whatever trade-offs they make. But they develop it, and as a user, you interact with all of these apps and all of these assets without thinking about it, right? So to me, that's the world that I want to see, like over the next, 2 to 4 years evolve.
Yeah, I kind of agree. It's kind of multi-chain in the background, like the plumbing in the background, but the users will just go to whatever use case or whatever front-end application they want to go to. But in the background, it'll use, whichever chain is better for speed or whichever one's better for security based on whichever use case it is.
Yeah, fully agree with those. One thing to add with that, so one concern I'm seeing is kind of the growing complexity. We don't just have one or two chains anymore. We have hundreds, thousands of chains. And I think in some form or another, there will probably some consolidation. And this might be just in the background, that this will be abstracted away from the user. Or it might also be that, certain technologies will maybe, prove to be more reliable or just a better fit than others. So curious to see how that will play out. But we'll definitely, have a multi-chain future.
But in all of these answers, what I hear is that we will have, let's say, natively cross-chain applications, right? So how do you see it playing out? Because at the moment we have many chains that are actually, there's a lot of copy-paste type of, there's a AMM on chain A, and then, there's a project doing AMM on chain B. And there's many of, let's say, the development that is going into just replicating on, every other different layers. How do you, think this will play out? Do you think that there is going to be elevation of these protocols into the cross-chain application, or do you think that rather somebody will come and consolidate it from top?
So I think that there are a couple of different programming models that could evolve, and I think we don't know which one is actually going to win. And I think for some use cases, one may be better attracting than the other. But the ideal world is as following, right? Like, I'm an application builder. I can deploy my application on one chain, right? That's my kind of home base that serves my database. But I have to maybe integrate with some cross-chain protocol to allow users to interact with my application, right? And so assuming your wallets on the other chains are sort of integrated with these protocols as well, then from a user experience, the interaction is native. So just like you're interacting with the application that's hosted on the same chain, but both of those kind of endpoints, the wallets and the applications, are integrated. And so from a user experience, it's frictionless. And so I think in terms of development paradigm, it's actually quite interesting that what we're going to see. Are we going to see things like application logic going and moving to where the assets are, or the other way around, right? Right now, what we're seeing is like assets being moved to where the application logic is to being executed, like through various bridging technologies. I think some protocols are doing the other way around, where they take their code and bring it to where the assets are. I think in the multi-chain world, it's gonna be interesting to see like which patterns sort of stick a little bit more once the protocols become native.
That's super interesting. I think, there was something similar called the data gravity problem with regards to machine learning, where we've discussed, should the computation go where the data is, or should the data go to where the computation is? I think that's an interesting point. I personally think, I have no idea how the future would look like, but at the end of the day, I think we have to go through this messy phase of fragmentation, where we'll have the same asset, liquidity split through different chains instead of it all representing the same underlying asset. Different bridging technologies having another layer of fragmentation. So I think that's just a natural process we need to go through, and what we come up with, I have no idea.
Nivan, any views?
I echo. I have no idea, but maybe there's, if there is some type of user aggregation and a bulk of users somewhere, that could help drive how this occurs.
Mm-hmm. Staying with the interoperability, like, are there any parallels with the historical development that we could take? And how is the Web3 different in terms of why do we need to create new interoperability standards?
So I think there's like a lot of parallels to be drawn, right, with the development of the internet. And I think, so if you look at the blockchain ecosystem, I think we're about, like 15, 16 years in the making, right? Even a little bit less than that. And so during the development of the internet, like 15 years in the making, you similarly had many different networks that were all fragmented and didn't really talk to each other that well. And those networks were operated by either like internet service providers or like universities or some type of organizations, right? And then first applications required interoperability protocols. People have iterated through dozens of different versions, kind of eventually settling down with a handful of protocols like TCP, IP. You have kind of border gateway transfer protocols and so on and so forth. And then all kinds of application layer protocols were built on top of it to make these application interactions as seamless as possible, right? And so I actually think we're like in a pretty similar phase right now in the blockchain ecosystem, right? So we have, in the hundreds of different chains that have utility of value. We're kind of figuring out these interoperability protocols and like infrastructure along the way. Once we figure out like some basic connectivity, we're going to be building application layer protocols on top of it. And, and that's when I think biggest use cases will only actually start coming, I think, in the coming years. So to me, it's surprising how analogous, I would say, like the ecosystem been evolving.
Yeah, I think that I feel the same way. I mean, I'd say that's about the only analogous there is when we came out of the Web 1 and Web 2. And it's still very decentralized, and I think the interoperability and the integrations will help, will be kind of what can build moats for certain parts of the ecosystem along the way.
I think some of the differences maybe are that, number one, these systems are in the open with potentially malicious actors. So in Byzantine environments, I think this is a major difference why this entire overhead of consensus execution environment exists in the first place for the applications that we're building. Another thing I think that is different is just the richness of the protocols themselves, representing the tokens that captures the value, the whole settlement layer. So I think in that sense, there's a different emphasis on, for example, security. While you had like a completely different trust assumption with a Web 2 centralized system and you just relied on an API of a single provider, I think here, because if one protocol wins over another, that token and that ecosystem will just capture most, if not all, of the value for that use case. Plus the fact that feels like there's much more funding behind that. I think it's a much more interesting competitive stage that we're in. I still agree with everything that Sergey said. I think that's 100% accurate. I think there's definitely analogies to be drawn there.
And I guess if I can actually add, on the differences, because I think it's quite important, right? I think why is like Web3 sort of exciting in some senses, because you do have like this glue of security properties that you get from these protocols and chains. You have a glue of data with compute, right, in some of the environments, and you have a distribution channels, right, like through open distributions, like self-custody and so on and so forth. And so in some sense, like for the Web 2, we had to build like separate stacks for all of those things, right? And it took years, and all those things were disconnected. And now, like in Web 3, all of a sudden, like these core properties are all in the same objects, and it's super fun to play with.
Yeah, I mean, on the value and economic model of it, the monetization model is obviously totally different, right? It's like the value accrual happened to on the user aggregation and ad revenue model, and now it's totally flipped or will be totally different. So obviously some major clear changes.
Mm-hmm. So at the moment, like we have, you are all representative of different, let's say, ecosystems, or like have different take on the interoperability. Maybe can you introduce like, what is the major interoperability standard, I don't know, on Solana, in Cosmos, and then also like how is Axelar different?
I mean, I think as a layer one, it's really just making sure you're integrated with as many projects as you can be. And that's kind of been our focus: exchanges, projects, wallets.
I mean, if you tell anyone in the Cosmos ecosystem that IBC is a bridge, then they'll probably shake their head in weird ways. But I think there's two differences if you compare traditional bridge architecture with IBC, which is what we call inter-blockchain communication. So the one thing is the use case. Traditionally, in my understanding, bridges are used to pass one message from one environment to another environment. Classically, you lock or burn it on the one side, and then you mint it on the other side. IBC does that as well. It's kind of the first use case, but IBC will enable other use cases in the future as well, because it's kind of an agnostic message passing protocol. Just to name maybe one other use case, an account on one blockchain will be able to manage an account on another blockchain, or an account on one blockchain will be able to participate in governance, or also do something like staking on another blockchain. So it's not just passing assets, but it's also general interoperability. And I think the second thing, just to comment a little bit on the kind of security model is, and Sergey can comment more on the security model of the bridges, but essentially for IBC, there has to be a relayer, but you don't really need to trust the relayer to the extent that you need to trust at a bridge, because assuming there's still an honest majority, which is 2/3 in the validator sets, all that's required is a sufficient state proof in the message itself that the message that is being passed contains. So in that sense, for any environment that has efficient light client support, you can just relay the message, and if there's a sufficient state proof, then you don't need any other trust partner. I think at bridges it's a little bit different, because there's like assumptions you have for the operators of that bridge.
Yeah, so I think what we're doing at Axelar is our job is to make it as simple as possible to connect the guys on the left with the guys on the right, in some sense, right? And the way we're doing it is what we're building is like an overlay network, you can think of it, where like at the core, we support multiple interoperability protocols. Like we support IBC because we're like based around Cosmos chain. We have our protocol for interacting with the VM chains. We have our protocol that has been built to interact, with Bitcoin networks. And so I think like if again kind of some of the early inspirations came in with from traditional like Web 2 and how it was developed with players like Akamai or Cloudflare, right? They were built like overlay service networks to deliver connectivity and to be able to kind of translate and route packets more effectively and be able to deliver content from one network to another with various mechanics underneath in those networks. And so that's the way we're building the Axelar network with that in mind. We support multiple interoperability protocols, building this routing infrastructure and kind of building all the gluing pipes to make it easier for ecosystems that today speak very sort of different languages and consensus rules and smart contract supports to kind of interact with one another, because you have to parse the information along the way and translate it from one language to another.
And maybe just to add to that, why Cosmos and IBC also needs needs someone like XLR is basically, I mentioned IBC requires efficient light client support, but you can also think of it as it requires finality on chain, because only then it can make sufficient assumptions to do the transaction. Because in proof of work environments, you don't have that instant finality, you have more something like a probabilistic finality. We basically need a proper bridge, and IBC will not work natively. IBC will only work when you can make these assumptions of finality.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of a space for everyone here.
Very good.
We're all friends.
I see that we are closely coming to the end, so let me open up. Are there any questions?
I actually wanted to follow up on yours comment there. The IBC supports proof of work chains specifically so that we could get to a world of ETH where it was running on WASM and we'd be able to program there. No one has done such an implementation, so like the difference between theory and practice, in theory it will support that. In practice, it'll be another year before someone gets to that point. But it's designed it's designed for that exactly because we want to be able to broadly interoperate not just within Cosmos, but people have already bridged to Celo and Polkadot and various other ecosystems. And so this is a direction to go to get lots of interoperability across a broad range of chains.
You developed
Say it again?
You developed IBC.
Yes, I was one of the people involved in the design and architecture of IBC.
Any reactions?
I did not know that. I think that's great.
Hence, we haven't implemented it yet.
Yeah.
We need him to know it.
Yeah, so I think my reaction to that, yes, right, probably. And I think the only question is what it's going to cost, right, at the end of the day, right? Like, one is there's engineering cost, and two, what's going to be the cost for sending packets, right? Like, so, verifying them in Solidity or other smart contract, what's going to be the gas cost and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, I think in principle there's a lot to continue extending IBC, maybe even like packet semantics, right, with other verification underneath it. So, yeah, I think it's, all good stuff.
The thing that spec, this goes back to the implementation thing, the gas cost management, and efficiency that you can get with a well-implemented bridge could be dramatic improvement over what's possible there. So definitely, I wasn't at all arguing that we don't need bridges.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I think I see one in the back.
Thank you. Two very quick questions. The first one is, where do you think most of the monetary value will occur if you look at the different layers?
I did not understand.
I have not done. Can you repeat it?
Yeah. Where do you think most of the monetary value will incur at the different layers? Will it be layer one? Will it be base layer? Will it be out of what you explained with the horse betting?
I feel like at the moment it's so early that there's not going to be a concentration. It's my theory. 5 years from now, or maybe it's 2, or maybe it's 10, that might change. But right now, I think there's value. There's not going to be a concentration of value accrual, and there's enough. It's so early in the stage that we're building blocks that there's value that will accrue at each of the layers.
Okay, thank you. And the second one would be, it's a very naive question, but do you see any security challenges from the arrival at one point of quantum computing?
Do we see security concern from quantum computing? Is that the question?
Any security issues with the development of quantum computing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can talk about that, but I think quantum computing is, something we should keep in mind, but at the same time, there's a lot of work to prepare industries across the whole spectrum for it, right? There is a kind of an ongoing, NIST standardization process to pick like basic cryptographic protocols to protect against quantum computing. Blockchains on themselves, need certain cryptographic primitives, and so once you migrate those primitives to, quantum resilient primitives, then, you should be fine. And people are just kind of in the process of figuring it out, then implementing it. I think one thing actually in the blockchain space that makes it a lot more resilient against quantum computers is because everybody plans for upgrades, right? Like,
Yeah.
many people have on-chain governance. Many people know how an upgrade is. We have validators that are responding, faster than you can wake up like in the middle of the night. So I think like blockchain people are actually more prepared than like traditional finance in some sense.
I think that's a great summary. I think I never really worried about that ever because it's unlikely that it will come up overnight where you don't really have time to prepare what you said, Sergey, like have quantum resilient measures or hashing functions in place, just replace those to make the systems more resilient, go through an upgrade process. I think that's probably more likely than the quantum computing to just overnight, breaking all the hashing functions that exist today, which I don't think is very likely.
So seeing that we don't have any more questions, there is one more. I don't see.
Hello. I wondered if the panelists could comment on, well, just going back to this chart you showed right at the start with Ethereum losing share in TVL, if the panelists could comment on the progress, as they understand it, of the merge and the likely success, and whether that will change that market dynamic over the next couple of years.
I don't know if you understood the question exactly.
Only partially. You can answer.
So what I understood was Ethereum and the merge, but I didn't really get the question. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, at the start, the TVL chart showed Ethereum had been losing share to everyone else. My question is whether that will change if and when the merge is completed.
I think the merge will happen. I don't see why that won't happen. It's been a meme for a long time, but now as we're approaching, the stage we're in, I don't really see why it wouldn't happen at this stage. Whether it will change the trajectory of the value capture or TVL, first of all, I'm not sure if the merge itself will be an important determining factor here, or if it will be other factors. It's hard to give a clear answer here, but I don't think the merge necessarily will make a difference. So whatever the reason for that is, might still remain with or without the merge.
I mean, I guess high-level thought is that I think no matter what happens with a single chain, including Ethereum, I think I'm a kind of a multi-chain maximalist in some sense, and I think the reason is like actually pretty technical, and I think it actually starts from some of the Cosmos ecosystem. The thinking is that applications effectively will need their own network / databases / namespaces to perform well, right? And I think kind of no matter what happens, with Ethereum, at some point you're going to have to continue to serve horizontally scaling the space one way or another. Ethereum is one answer to that, and it has a certain user base and it has a certain technical characteristics. I think many other platforms are attractive for other characteristics, and so I think it's just going to continue growing.
Yeah, I mean, I think developers and projects choose their layer ones on multiple variables, but I'm sure two key ones are probably speed and cost. And if this is just getting the speed faster, but not really bringing down the gas fees on Ethereum, then there's a headwind and a tailwind. So it's hard to give a one-way answer.
Thank you very much. So I think this concludes our panel, but thank you very much for coming over. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.